Advent bosses are a key part of the Battle Cat's progression system. An Advent stage features an individual boss fight with a unique boss, usually intended to be a very challenging stage to conquer. Players who beat such a stage will be given a reward unit in the form of an Advent drop, which are helpful units that range from some of the best units in the entire game to just okay, I guess. While a lot of the current meta revolves around the strongest Advent drops, such as Slime, Bullet Train, and Rock, the bosses themselves play a key part in defining the meta, with each stage having different counters and different strategies used to beat them. In today's video, we'll be looking into all 20 different Advent bosses and ranking them all from worst to best. I did a story boss ranking quite a while ago, so it makes sense for me to make an additional one on Advent bosses. Before we get into the ranking, let's first talk about how we're going to go about this ranking. Advent bosses will be ranked on a variety of factors, such as their mechanics, how well designed their stages are, and how fun they are to fight. These factors will be heavily based on when the Advent came out, as it's unfair to judge a boss that wasn't balanced around future power creep. Having a good visual design is nice as well, but that isn't as important as the other factors. As requested by most of you guys, I'll be judging both the original, restriction, and revenge stages that each Advent boss has. How this works is that I'll score each of the 3 stages individually from F to S, then display an average score for the Advent stages overall. The original stage is the initial boss fight with the Advent boss, and is the most important stage for the boss to get right. For that reason, I'll be weighing this stage much more compared to the other 2. The restriction stage is the same exact one as the original stage, but with an added restriction. I'll be judging this stage on whether or not the restriction led to an interesting and fun change in gameplay. And finally, the revenge stage is a different stage from the original that sees the player fight the Advent boss again in a different way. This one is judged on how well it executes an experience that is different from the original fight, but still plays like a fun and well-designed stage. Some Advents don't have a restriction and revenge stage, so their average score will simply be their original stage's score. As for the brutal Advents, I'll do the same thing with averaging the score from all 4 of their stages, but will put double the weight on the final stage. Although these scores will be useful for understanding which stages of the bosses I like or dislike, the overall position in the ranking may not be equivalent to their average score, as I may move some bosses higher or lower just on what I feel fits them better. Anyways, let's start ranking these bosses now. Starting off with the F tier. Bosses in this tier fail to be a meaningful fight in pretty much all of their stages. I don't think anyone would really care if these bosses were outright deleted from the game because of how bad they are. Anyways, I should stop using plural nouns here because this tier only has one singular Advent boss, and it should be no surprise on who it is. So let's see it. Dormy is about as big of a fumble of a boss as you can get. Fast speed, low range, but gigantic LD with a guaranteed slow makes it so you have to juggle her, or else your entire team gets repeatedly blasted and permaslowed. First off, this is just not a good idea in the slightest. It's not a fun concept, and it's very hard to make a fun stage from this concept. So Panos instead decided to just add a slow Kurosawa backliner and random peons as support. What they may not have expected is that you can just lure Dormy to the base and completely solo her with a Bahamut chain. Great design, Panos. I definitely enjoyed playing this boss fight that you gave me. Now surely after a fumble this bad, Panos would use their brains and make at least one of the 2 remake stages good, right? Well, no. Dormy is screwed by concept, so instead Panos just said screwed and added the worst restriction to the already worst Advent boss. In Babies First, the player now has to beat this oppressive boss with only normal cats and uber rares. Now you can't cheese the stage with a Bahamut chain, but at that cost you can't really do anything else at all. Either use ubers to solo Dormy just like with Bahamut, or you can spam all your normal cats and pray that they stunlock Dormy at the base long enough for you to kill her before she inevitably starts sweeping away everything you have. I feel like this stage is balanced around true super feline, which is incredibly dumb considering you need 15,000 user rank to have him, which is pretty much post-game levels of progression. But even looking at the revenge stage, it's literally just Broton levels of peon spam with the same old Dorme as before, meaning you can just spam ranged attackers with your Bahamut to win just as easily. I can't comprehend what Ponos was trying to do in any of these 3 stages, so Dorme is easily and by far the worst advent boss in the game. We actually don't have a D tier, so we're moving on to the C tier next. I guess the advent bosses are pretty good. These C tier bosses are flawed, but have some good aspects. I don't think they are the most fun or interesting, but I wouldn't call them bad additions to the game. Heavenly Herald Papu is an okay boss. Papu is a tanky backliner with immunities like Dabu, but has 1 knockback and super low base damage. She deals a 40% toxic every time she attacks, and has a 200% strength and below 30% HP. In the debut stage, you are fighting Papu alongside weak support enemies such as Surrel, Waldoge, and Dachshund. For some reason, the Dachshund is super weak at only 300%, which basically means the only source of pushing power in the stage is Surrel. It's incredibly easy and kind of boring, but nowhere as bad as Dorme. The restriction stage allows rare and super rare only, removing options like Bahamut but overall keeping the gameplay the exact same for the most part. The revenge stage takes a more interesting approach, with dangerous enemies like Puffington and General Gregory to push you back from a longer stage length. Unfortunately, this stage has Ultra Baba, which means you can just spare your stack to win, but putting aside this flaw, it is a solid stage. Papu isn't an exceptionally bad advent boss, but in a game with so many great advent bosses, mediocrity causes her to place at the second lowest. Queen V is a boss that brings me a lot of painful memories of the stage upon first release. I'll Be Bug is a pretty infamous stage for one thing, which is RNG. Your goal is to kill 2 Professor A's while Queen V snipes your units and curses them, and the best way to do this is to weaken them with Rocat and then send in islands to beat them up. The problem with this idea is that Rocat's weaken comes at a 20% chance per hit, and Professor A also has a 20% chance to slow your units for 2 seconds. These 2 aspects of RNG can cause the stage to be especially frustrating. You can time all of your Rocats correctly, all for them to just not weaken Professor A, or get caught slowed outside their attacking range and lose a ton of health that way. Professor A slowing Bahamut will also cause him to lose a ton of his damage output, and losing too much damage this way can cause you to lose even when you have timed everything correctly. Islands are also not the best units to be forced into using, due to them being incredibly reliant on either normal levels or user rank 3650 for level 40 Manix. While Courier exists now as a better attacker and easier unit to get progression wise, for years we were stuck doing the RNG filled hell of the original way. Although there are some cool concepts in theory, such as timing your islands in row to not get hit by Queen V, and the overall tempo of the stage is pretty well designed, because of the RNG present and how much it really sucked to play back then, I can't give this first stage any pity. Maybe it seems a bit nitpicky, but all of these little things combined just prevent me from liking it. Queen V's restriction stage is top row only. Having 5 units to deal with the stage sounds horrendous, but it's actually a pretty fair restriction given modern creep like Courier as well as Rock, and the ability to use Slime itself. The Revenge stage just spawns basic backliners as support for Queen V, meaning you can pretty much just spawn LD or fast rangers inside Queen V's blind spot and make the stage a complete joke. I don't particularly like any of these stages, so it's another mediocre advent just like Papu. The difference being that Papu's stages are too easy, while Queen V's are just not designed well to be fun. King Wawa is a pretty nice boss in concept, but some of his stages have aspects that bother me quite a bit. The original stage N1 Grand Prix is pretty well constructed from a stage schematic standpoint, but its restriction of normal and Uber or Legend Rare only is something I'm not quite a fan of. I did already talk about this in the Dorme section, but I will say that Wawa's stage works much better with this. This boss isn't as oppressive, and the supporting enemies are fine as well. So it's a pretty good stage if you have the proper unit levels to beat it. This is where my bigger problem with the restriction comes, however, because obtaining high enough normal levels to make this stage beatable is kind of finicky when it comes to progression. Even for a boss released back in the 6.7 era, while getting high normal levels was standardized back then, it still stands out compared to all other advents for restricting your ability to play the stage properly. You can supplement lower level normals for Ubers, but because of how Wawa is designed as a boss, there aren't actually many Ubers which excel on this stage. If anything, I think if N1 Grand Prix were to come out today, it would be pretty cool as a dojo stage with setup lineup and levels, giving the player the first 9 normal cats and at a balanced level to sort of act as mastery of the normal cats. But anyways, moving on to the restriction and revenge stages, the super rare only restriction makes N1 much easier due to the variety and power of the units you have, which kind of just ends up making it a joke. And the revenge stage, Wrath of the Doge Lord, is actually quite interesting. You have to fight against a massive peon spam like Broton from Cats of the Cosmos, but with Wawa as a backline boss. You can cheese this stage by juggling Wawa, but most players will try to survive by using fast respawn attackers to clear the wave, and piercing damage to juggle Wawa until the peons subside and the coast is clear to kill him. It's a pretty fun and unique stage, making it my favorite of these 3. While Wawa isn't exactly a bad boss overall, the gripes I do have with him cause him to place this low. Moving on to the B tier already, I'd say this is where these bosses are nice additions to the game. They might have some good and some bad to them, but overall balance out to be good bosses. Sathenko Moon 8 is a boss name that I refuse to attempt pronouncing again, so I'll just call it Rashomon after the stage map name. He's basically just another Hanya variant, high damage and range with a little bit of pierce. Rashomon does slow on hit, but this doesn't matter too much. Supporting him are a variety of enemies like Nimoy Boar, Chick-fil-A, and Puffington, while Cerberus kids are simple peons. It's a pretty chill endurance stage with a tanky backliner boss, something we've seen many times in the past. There's nothing really wrong with it, it just isn't the most interesting. So a good B tier is fair for this boss. Okame is the first tier 2 advent added, and he holds up decently well. With Okame's long range and guaranteed knockback, dealing with him is pretty hard with most regular units. You'll need anti-red or black tanks or rushers like Row, Islands, or Bullet Train to deal with him properly, but luckily this stage is built around Okame being an oppressive boss and only has simple peons like Ginger Snake and Doge Dark alongside 5 waves of Gory Blacks. The stage plays out like a short endurance stage, where the goal is to survive the 5 main waves of Gory Blacks, but if you have enough damage you can instead kill Okame early to end the stage faster. It's quite a well balanced stage, my only real complaint being the reliance on Row and Islands for similar reasons to my gripes with Queen V. You know, thinking about it more, you really were screwed back then if you didn't have Rowcat. But anyways, gameplay wise, this stage is much smoother and much more skill oriented with timing units like support attackers or Bahamut to get maximum value on the waves. The Pure Land is solid, but what about the restriction and revenge stages? Well, the restriction sets cat limit to 5, which is a decent way to lower the player's damage and safety, but the strategy to beat the stage is basically the same. However, Talented Heavy Assault CAT is now a thing and basically able to solo the stage, so that's an option if you don't want to fight the stage again. Okame's Tea House features Okame with spams of Ms. Devils, which changes the stage from a tanking or rusher one into a stage where you use mid-range DPS to melt through the shields of these Ms. Devils before he reaches your base. It's a pretty enjoyable twist and plays differently from the original, so I think it's one of the better revenge stages in the game. All in all, Okame is a really solid Advent boss and was a good way for Ponos to start Tier 2 Advents. Cappy Kawano is an interesting brutal Advent, and the first one on our list. His 3-part multi-hit that spams out surges is quite interesting. It makes using units like Rock take more thought than they would otherwise. The first stage here is a decent introduction and testing grounds for how Kawano works, and the next stage is a pretty typical boss stage where you have to take down Bun Bun Blacks and an Otham supporting him. The third stage sees a ton of surge spamming enemies to match Kawano's own fighting style, so you probably want to bring lots of surge immune units. These are all decent stages, but my favorite is definitely the last one. In Ghost King Finale, you have to fight Kawano with Golem Sunfish as a super backliner, and then Cappy Jr. who spawns a little bit into the fight. Not only is the three enemies synergy between them pretty good, but I also like how they paired Kawano and his son together in the same stage. It just feels right to do, and it plays really well. My main complaint with this boss is that the meta for it is just pretty bland. You pretty much have to just bring Surge Immune or Traitless Tinking units, which the game doesn't have many of to begin with. But apart from that, the stage does flow well with the units you usually end up using. So for the second Brutal Advent to be released in the game, it was a pretty good one. Evil Emperor is a pretty forgettable boss, albeit not a bad one. In this stage you'll fight Evil Emperor, who has low base damage but the ability to make a surge that freezes and curses your units. Supporting him are Cappies and an Old Horn as the main threats. You can play this stage in a variety of ways, such as trying to rush down the Emperor before Old Horn comes, or just play very defensive and try to survive the Old Horn at the end of the stage. I do think that the enemies chosen and the boss's function combine to allow a lot of units to work here that wouldn't otherwise, like Manic Dark. Despite the stage not being the hardest, I think that it still provides a balanced challenge, and allows for a variety of units to work well, which gives the stage a fun and diverse meta. Although it's not the most engaging or difficult of Advent bosses out there, Evil Emperor is still a solid stage that is a relatively enjoyable time. Possessed Empress is an interesting boss that utilizes the Aku shield as her main point of interest. While her endurance isn't actually that high, having 10 knockbacks and just under a million health, she has a gigantic 1.2 million HP shield that regenerates after every knockback. Using shield piercing units is recommended against her, like Aku Researcher, but back on release there were hardly any good ones, so some players would have to fight her without shield piercers at all. While this is a nice challenge for the start of the stage, once you finish all major enemy waves it kinda becomes a mundane chip battle. The fight itself is pretty much another long-range backliner endurance stage with support from common mid-range pushers. Empress does do a guaranteed mini-wave in slow, but timing your units around it allows you to stall her pretty well. It's about an average stage, not much else to really say. The restriction stage of Special and Uber only makes things a bit more challenging, but the stage is mostly the same. You'll most likely have something like Supercard to shield pierce the boss now though, so cleanup shouldn't be a problem. The Revenge stage has 3 major support enemies to help Empress in the form of Cappy, Midnight D, and Master A, spawning in waves kind of like Evil Emperor's stage. The resemblance is quite nice, but the stage itself is pretty basic. Overall, Empress gets Bs across the board and isn't the most remarkable Advent, but she's pretty cool anyways. Baku is the last deadly difficulty Advent to be added to the game, and despite that is actually one of the easiest. The stage starts off by spawning a 300% start-off boar, or as I like to call it, Jerry, and this is probably the hardest part of the stage. Once you manage to safely stall Jerry, you can stack piercing damage on him and then proceed to hit the base, where you'll find Baku. Baku herself has a small 500k HP with 10 knockbacks and a slow speed, but if she manages to attack, she will have a guaranteed chance to freeze your units across a massive LD range. Luckily, it's super easy to kill her with LD spam or freeze her with Bombercat to prevent this. Not the most difficult stage, but I did like it when it came out at least. The restriction stage has only normal, rare, and Uber or Legend rares, removing core units like Volter, Manic Legs, and Bombercat. This makes the stage a bit harder, but the real problem is actually dealing with Jerry. You don't have access to Ro or Icat anymore, making him pretty obnoxious and kind of RNG to beat. That's the main aspect I dislike about this restriction stage, but besides that, it's pretty decent. Revenge of the Dreamer, however, is a pretty neat stage. You'll fight lots of black enemies here, and the main bosses are 2 Elder Sloths, alongside 3 Bakus instead of 1. The stage plays out very well due to how it spawns waves, and really gets you on your toes trying to kill these Bakus while your stack gets nuked by Elder Sloths. One of my favorite revenge stages honestly, which is probably the main thing carrying this Advent. So overall, Baku gets a high B in my books. Despite being one of the lowest ranked of the original Deadly Advents, she's still a pretty nice one. It honestly just shows you how well designed the original Deadly Advents are. We have now reached the A tier, and this is where I'd say that these Advent bosses are great additions to the game, and Ponos should follow them for examples on how to build a good Advent boss. They might not be absolutely perfect, but the good heavily outweighs the bad here. Puffsley's Comet is a fairly old merciless Advent that is pretty basic, but still enjoyable. Puffsley himself is a variant of the regular Mr. Puffington, but with more damage, health, and range, giving the player similar counterplay opportunities. The stage itself revolves around spawning waves of star pangs that the player must defeat before they stack up, all while additional support from enemies like Project A and Corporal Wayland back them up. You can either choose to kill Puffsley fast using high damage units, or to survive the onslaught of star pangs by bringing a lot of DPS and stalling power. I am a pretty big fan of how this stage flows gameplay wise, often requiring the player to time units accordingly to not waste cash. It was a challenging but fair stage at the time, even if it might not be that hard today. But speaking of today, somehow Puffsley still doesn't have a restriction and revenge stage yet, which doesn't make any sense at all. We really should have gotten a Super Cat True Form years ago, but it is still something Ponos hasn't looked into. Comparing Puffsley to the next Advent boss that came out after him, which was Cappy Jr., it's crazy to think that Cappy Jr. got his restriction and revenge stages almost 5 whole years ago, and we still don't have it for Puffsley. A lack of these stages kind of makes it hard to justify placing him any higher, and I really want Ponos to drop a stage, but it will probably take 5 more years before they do it. I guess floor 47 was enough proof that Puffsley could be good in another stage. But regardless, Puffsley's original stage is quite nice, and he's a great boss overall. Bonagrios is the newest Brutal Advent boss, and comes with a lot of different stages. He hits far, has a ton of health and only 4 knockbacks, alongside a guaranteed blast attack and 20% crit chance. The first stage introduces him alongside a strong Master A and Wild Doge supporting them, and I personally am not too big a fan of it since it doesn't allow you to really learn the boss on a fair testing ground. The enemies here are too oppressive, and the stage is honestly one of the harder ones overall, which doesn't make sense for being stage 1. Stage 2, however, is a pretty decent testing ground for introducing the boss, but not the most interesting stage. Stage 3 is arguably the hardest one of all 4, forcing the player to deal with Teacher Bun Bun and Lil Bun Bun spam on top of the Bonagrios already. This stage can be very difficult to handle since the other Bun Buns shut down your Behemoth Slayer units, but a good rush is the best way to handle it. Well, or you can cyberstack. Stage 4 is my favorite of the bunch, and sees you fighting Bonagrios alongside Kurokroc for some Behemoth action. In this stage you actually want to use powerful Behemoth Slayers like Courier for damage, and both Soap and Egg Pod for stalling the duo alongside your other units. It's kind of a timing minigame, and honestly, a surprisingly fun stage. The aspect I do dislike the most is Bonagrios' 20% crit chance, capable of chunking your attackers or defensive units, which can be pretty annoying. I understand if this is a deal breaker for some people, but personally I found that the inherent nature of the stage to use disposable units ended up balancing out the RNG. Putting that aside though, I think that every stage in this map is better than the one before it, which makes the ending 2 stages redeem most of the quality in my opinion. Although not perfect, Bonagrios proves to the player what brutal difficulty really means, and gives us another very solid Brutal Advent overall. Queen Bee is a classic Advent boss that remains one of my favorites from back in the Deadly Advent era. I honestly think that the first 4 Deadly Advents are some of the best in the game, each of them bringing something fun and unique to the table. In Queen Bee's case, she's a boss that has a massive LD blind spot as well as a long guaranteed slow, which makes timing units into her blind spot a must for influencing the stage. Paired together with her is the Sloth as a secondary boss, and support from Croxos and waves of Brawlos to add pressure. Because timing units inside Queen Bee's blind spot was already a challenge for the time, I think the support enemies not being too scary is a good thing. Pretty much anything you slip in can help defend against these guys, and eventually once you kill either Queen Bee or the Sloth, you'll have won that stage. It's a fun stage when it came out, even if it goes down extremely easily nowadays. The restriction stage isn't the best though, as 3,900 and under cost-wise is a very generous restriction that pretty much only bans Bahamut in certain Ubers. Given the power creep that would have happened by this time, the stage tends to get swept and there's not much interesting about this restriction. Royal Jelly Hell, however, is an interesting stage. Instead of being an endurance one like the original, you are forced to rush down Queen Bee while she's being supported by tanky enemies like Cyberhorn and Dark Aura. There's a variety of units and strategies you can use on this stage, so I find it a very fun stage. Really the only thing holding back this boss is the lame restriction stage, but apart from that, Queen Bee is a great advent with solid stages. Death Angel Zionel is an interesting brutal advent that takes a unique twist on the original Clionel fight. This time, Zionel is a zombie variant of Clionel who has much less overall health, but revives infinitely at 50% HP. The stage also spawns continuous peons as well as reinforcements of zombie and alien enemies, like Starping, General Gregory, and Zoosh. The biggest kicker here is that there are actually 2 Zionels instead of 1, effectively forcing the player to rush down the first Zionel before stalling until they are ready to take down the second one. The original strategy on launch played unlike pretty much any stage in the game, where you try to rush down Zionel and then snipe her to death with the Holy Blast cannon before doing the same to the second Zionel. Although I'm not the biggest fan of having a stage be balanced around a cannon level, Zionel was still doable with lower leveled Holy Blast if your damage calculating skills were good enough. As more power creep came out slightly after launch, the new strat was to stack Cadaver Bear Cat in order to take out the Zionels easily. The stage isn't quite as interesting with this strategy, but I won't take away points from the original because of this. However, when looking at the restriction stage, 1,500 cost and less is pretty much a placebo restriction, kind of like the one for Queen Bee, and you'll just abuse the same Cadaver Bear stacking strat for an easy win. The Revenge stage, however, is one of my favorites. You have to deal with 3 waves of enemies set by base HP, each getting harder than the last and having a Zionel with them. The final wave pairs Zionel alongside Chibionel and a Saint Dober, pressuring the player to kill Saint Dober as fast as possible before Zionel kills your base. It's a pretty cool stage, and overall, I think Zionel is just a cool advent boss with how their stages were executed, even if they may be very susceptible to power creep. Infernal Tyrant Yandom, or Standum as some like to call him, is the very first brutal advent added to the game. Brutal advents were different from regular ones due to having 4 stages of increasing difficulty instead of just 1. Being a new difficulty tier, you'd expect Standum to be very hard, but he's actually not too difficult. Despite this, I think that his stages are very well designed. Stage 1 has you fight Standum without much support to act as a testing ground and allow the player to learn how to counter him, while Stage 2 adds some Chick-fil-A's and Scissoroos so that you'll have to figure out how to counter him alongside support. Stage 3 ramps this up even more by adding a secondary boss, and in this case Elder Sloth, which you will have to take out while supported by various Aku enemies. The final stage is probably my favorite, where you have to deal with a very hard pushing Emost while Standum acts as the backliner. After you kill him, you'll have to deal with a Toucan while Standum is pretty close to your base, then try to push the boss back before he causes you to lose. This one's a pretty cool stage for having the player fight Standum at 3 different stage lengths, with different implications for each one. I also think that these stages are very clean and there's not much wrong with any of them. All serve a unique and important purpose for this bundle of stages. Overall, Standum was a fantastic way to kickstart the new brutal advents, and one of the better advent bosses in the game overall. Hanya is a classic advent boss that still holds up to this day. 3 knockbacks and 1 million health on a slow attacking backliner doesn't seem that threatening, but by weakening your cat units to 25% of their base damage, the stage becomes a battle of endurance. You're forced to deal with the waves of Bor and Arost, each of which have different counters, all while chipping Hanya in the downtime. It's one of the most memorable endurance stages at the time due to how high stakes it is, where failing to kill an Arost can cause grave consequences. I think Realm of Carnage also had one of my favorite evolutions in terms of how the stage developed with the game. At the start, it was a basic endurance stage, But then new strategies like the I Can't Rush were invented, and there were more ways to play it. Nowadays we have much more powerful units like Courier, but the identity of the stage still remains. I am not penalizing Advent bosses for aging badly, but I will like to mention when a stage ages pretty gracefully. It's a tried and true sign of a good stage design in my opinion. Anyways, moving on to the restriction, Wrath of Carnage only allows normal, special, and Uber or Legend rares, which essentially brings the stage back to its roots. I would normally not be a fan of a restriction stage playing similar to its original, but Wrath of Carnage has the player use a lot of different additions to make the stage more interesting, such as the Lil Cats, Legends, or even the pre-talent purchasable special cats. While I wasn't a fan of balancing N1 Grand Prix or Babies First around Ubers, that was due to how little Ubers in the game worked well there, and I think that having a lot of Ubers work well on a stage is much better. I think the biggest flaw with Hanya has to be the revenge stage though, as it is simply fighting Hanya alongside some pretty basic zombie enemies, and doesn't really stand out as too challenging or interesting. Regardless, Hanya's original stage stands out as one of my favorites, and alongside its restriction stage have seen a lot of different metas develop, which is pretty cool. We're finally at the S tier now, and these are the 4 Advent bosses that I think are ahead of the others in terms of having consistent and well-designed stages. Pretty much everything is spot on for these bosses, from concept to gameplay execution, and even getting the difficulty right. In simple terms, these bosses are awesome. Dabu of the Dead is another boss that is probably one of the first you'll think of when hearing the term Advent boss. In Parade of the Dead, you'll be forced to deal with a gigantic Dabu who has 3 million health and immunity to all debuffs, dealing big 30k damage piercing hits to your units that will slow them for a while. Because of this, tanks and cost efficient damage is the way to go on this stage. He's supported by alternating waves of angels and zombies, each of which play differently, so you can adjust your strategy to use units like Bahamut on certain waves. It's a very open-ended stage. You can choose to do as much damage as possible to Dabu to rush him down, or you can play more defensively and try to survive the stage's hardest waves before it becomes safer to spend units on Dabu himself. Alternatively, you can also cheese the stage by clipping Bahamut through him, but I'm not really counting it against Dabu since it was pretty hard to do. I honestly think that this might be the best designed Advent stage when it comes to using Ubers as well. Most Ubers, even if they don't target Angel or Zombie, can be useful to help deal with the waves. This stage's affinity for Ubers also translates well into the restriction, where Prisoner's Progress has a 1200 cost and above restriction. Similar to Hanya, this takes the player back to the roots of the stage but with a twist. You'll want to run classic Jamira cats here, but also can use the new mid-rangers like Pizza and Time Traveler. Ubers are also going to be the backbone of this stage, and pretty much any Uber with decent offensive stats can be great at helping deal with the waves. It's a stage where regardless of what the player pulled, they can be satisfied seeing their favorite Uber put in a lot of work. The Revenge stage, March to Death, might be the single most infamous Advent stage in the game, as it flips the entire concept of the original stage and turns it into a metal stage, where Dabu pushes you down the field as you have to destroy waves of metal enemies. A lot of people hate it due to metal enemy RNG, but I honestly think it's probably the single most well-designed metal stage in the game. The different metal enemy threats come in different waves, allowing you to adjust what counters you use for them based on what's currently on the field. Timing your units to avoid Dabu's attacks makes a huge difference and is usually what turns this stage from seemingly RNG into consistent. If I'm being honest, there are much worse offenders when it comes to RNG in Advent bosses. I think that despite the bad reputation it gets, March to Death is probably as good as you can get for a metal stage in the game, and for that it probably deserves an award for taking a terribly designed trait and making something cool from it. But yeah, overall Dabu is a really good addition to the game and one of my favorite Advent bosses. For being the first Advent boss ever added to the game, Cruel Angel Lionel stands as one of the most important additions to the game. No Plan A is a very interesting stage, having the player rush down a boss through their blind spot and then survive until they can do it again. Cruel Angel Lionel has 2.4 million HP and 4 knockbacks, while also having a ton of damage and a giant LD blind spot. Alongside it are constant trolley bloggers and waves of Sleipnir and angelic Gories. On release, this stage was unlike anything else before, so players had to get creative. They invented a strategy where you use Awakened Bahamut to chain the Sleipnir and then spam DPS units inside the blind spot until the next angelic Gory wave came, where you would then lure and kill the next Sleipnir with your next Bahamut before winning. This is simpler on paper than in practice, as pretty much anything can go wrong. No Plan A was really the first time players utilized Awakened Bahamut's full potential, and on top of being the first Advent boss, it was also the first deadly difficulty stage. It was easily the hardest stage in the game, but it was also beatable with the right skills and strategies. Power creep gave the player enough power to kill the boss in a single rush, but the identity of the stage remained solid. I definitely call it the single best original Advent stage ever, and to this day it has become a hallmark and progression for players. Moving on to the restriction stage, New Testament forces the player down to a cat limit of 5, which changes a lot on how the stage is played. No longer are the days of spamming everything for as much DPS as possible. Now you have to deploy every single unit with care and optimize Bahamut to the fullest. It's honestly one of the best restriction stages, and I'd say it's the best Advent restriction stage as well. With two of the best respective stage types for Advent bosses, the one keeping this boss from being number 1 is the Revenge stage. A Cat Screaming Love isn't a bad stage, but it's a pretty forgettable rematch that simply adds relic doges alongside other angel peons without much tempo or flow. But overall, the first two stages are extremely good, and the influence of this Advent boss is very important to the game as a whole, so it's an easy top 3 placement for me. Cappy Jr. is one of the bosses that a lot of people love, and it's pretty easy to see why. Cappy Jr. actually introduced the Surge ability, where upon hitting a cat unit creates a pillar that damages your units and has a lasting hitbox. At the time of release, no cat units had Surge immunity, so the player had to carefully play around his Surge ability. The best way to do this was to bait Cappy Jr. to miss by using other enemies in the stage, such as Scissoros that spawned occasionally. To minimize Surge damage, the player would use ranged damaging meat shields like Cameraman instead of traditional ones, and would also use anti-traitless crowd control units like Glass or Vendor. The Thrillers were here as peons that could block hits from these CC units, as well as waste hits from your attackers while not giving much money back on kill. All aspects of this stage come together to create a stage with a lot of nuance and strategy, and one that is very satisfying to play. The restriction stage released much later had only normals, rares, ubers, and legend rares, which took away key options like Pizza Cat and other super rares for DPS, and Awakened Bahamut for burst damage. Not too different from the original, but still was a solid restriction. Water Conservancy, the Revenge stage, sees you fight Cappy Jr. alongside support from Relic Doges, Trolley Bloggers, Owl Bros, and 2 Loris. These Loris change the stage dynamic drastically by being LD backliners, and taking them out is a challenge that requires creative strategies. On release, players would be forced to use lots of crowd control from units like Cyberpunk and Deadeye, while playing far back with cost-efficient units. You could also use weakened crowd control to try and chain down Cappy Jr. with Bahamut and Edie for burst damage. Updates soon after changed the identity of the stage drastically, however. The Special Cat talent update in 10.0 allowed the stage to be beaten up with Surge Immune Beefcake and Gato Amigo, which offered an expensive but easy way to win. Later in 10.2, Boulder Cat was introduced and the stage got the identity it has now, where you use Research Rock to make Cappy Jr. miss his hits repeatedly. Most people associate this rock timing with Cappy Jr. from the start, but it's important to remember that on release, rock just didn't even exist yet. It's interesting how a single unit redefined the entire identity of this Advent boss, which feels unique among every other one. Regardless, these updates happened so close to launch that I feel like it's fair to give them some credit. Although because this is power creep, I won't be giving Water Conservancy a straight S rank. Even so, Cappy Jr. is an incredible boss on all fronts, and is definitely a standout experience in the game, whether you have power creep or not. He's a fantastic boss, but I personally think there's one that's just a little bit better. Everlord Wan Wan is a boss that flies under the radar for some, but upon closer examination reveals one of the most creative and well-designed advent bosses ever. Every boss in S tier here takes a specific mechanic in Battle Cats and utilizes it well to make an unforgettable battle. For Dabu, it was using immunities to make him one of the sturdiest walls in the game. For Lionel, she used LD blind spots for an adrenaline-filled rush, and Cappy Jr. introduced the surge attack for a new mechanic entirely. Wanwan here utilizes warp, but in a different way than regular warp enemies. He's similar to King Wawa, but instead of knocking back enemies every hit, his final hit does reduced damage but warps away units for 66 seconds. Alongside this, the stage comes with the restriction of cat limit 10. Unlike the restriction on N1 Grand Prix, this restriction is creative and combines with the boss for a unique gimmick. Now when Wanwan warps your units, they get taken away while also clogging the cat limit, which can cause you to not be able to spawn more units to defend the rest of the enemies there. Supporting Wanwan are 2 waves of Cappies, alongside Sir Rels, Croconators, Relic Doges, and Mr. Celeboodles. The pressure from these enemies is light in theory, but problematic when your cat limit is filled. You are forced to time your units so that Wanwan doesn't warp them into jail, or make sure that they die before he can take them. The stage plays out dynamically with most of your spawns being reactive to the current field situation. Different types of units have different pros and cons, such as smaller units being replaceable and able to die so that they don't get warped, and larger units being more individually powerful and less detrimental if they do happen to be warped. Dogsville is just one of the best advent stages ever designed, and I honestly don't think it receives the respect it deserves. Dogsville really just is an insane stage. Literally. On release, the stage accidentally had its difficulty set to insane, which is pretty funny since it was a merciless stage. Ponos even referenced this with the restriction stage, intentionally making the stage difficulty set to insane as a nod to the original mistake. But moving on to the restriction stage, Dogsville Annex has one simple change that for some people might not even matter. The restriction here is simply banning Ubers and Legend Rares, which is probably the funniest restriction Ponos has ever done. Not only does this work as the polar opposite of N1 Grand Prix, making the stage have no impact from Ubers instead of being reliant on them, but some Ubers were actually the best units to bring for this stage, like strong warp immune Ubers that could kill stuff risk-free. Now the player is forced to play carefully instead of just relying on an easy way out, which is very cool in my opinion. Meanwhile, the no Uber players are just chilling with a rebeat while they laugh at this amazing restriction put in place. The revenge stage, Top Dog, is also pretty good. There's no restrictions here, so the player gets the full cat limit of 50, but instead Wanwan is supported with zombies like Coffin Zoge and Zappy, as well as piercing damage enemies like Gobble and Pigeon. The idea is that Wanwan warping your cat units will cause them to reappear at unpredictable times, and either trigger attacks from Gobble or Pigeon at the wrong time, or cause you to miss a zombie kill timing. This stage plays out pretty nice as well. You have to be careful not to get too many units warped so that you can defeat the enemies here, but you can also intentionally warp some useful units, like Bullet Train, to come back and deal bonus damage later. It's just a fun stage, which honestly applies to all of Wanwan stages. Wanwan is an advent boss that's creative, unique, balanced, and fun, which pretty much makes him the perfect advent boss in my eyes. So yeah, that was every single advent boss in the game ranked, and since we're done, I'll show you all the scores I gave for them. Again, the exact order doesn't match the average score from all the bosses, but you should get a good idea on which stages I like more than the others. Advent bosses are a really cool part of progression in the Battle Cats, and I do think that the majority of them are great designs that add something to the game. Well, maybe just if your name isn't Dorame. But yeah, that's about it for this video, so have a good day and I'll see you guys in the next one.